think we'll go ahead and get started. I imagine that some people will filter in as our event moves forward. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to our lecture today in the Eurasia Initiative, or at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, as you see on your screen. Today we have Professor Hannah Chapman from Miami University. Hannah is, Professor Chapman. I knew her before she was a professor, and she's a terrific professor doing phenomenal work. She's the Karen and Adeed Dawisha Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science at Miami University in Ohio. She reports, and you may see I'm not sure if you can see the sticker that she voted, which is good, in Ohio. Hannah got her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018, where she did a dissertation which won the best dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, participating in autocracy. Hannah is well published on a variety of different important issues in top journals, so International Studies Quarterly, Comparative Politics, Democratization, and so on. She does really cutting-edge work, both conceptually and methodologically, not to mention empirically, as we'll hear about today. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Hannah. Normally we would, have you physically in Toronto. Today you would be experiencing sunny skies and 23 degrees Celsius, which is, by the way, warm. We would, go for a walk or take you out to lunch. But we can't do that, so we'll have to kind of do a rain check, as it were, on that. And maybe in a year or so, we'll have the pleasure of having you to Toronto in person. But welcome. We look forward to hearing from you on this topic: information management and authoritarian legitimation in, quote, the direct line with Vladimir Putin. So, welcome, Hannah.
Great, thank you so much, Ed. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm really sad I can't be there with you all in Toronto. It is pretty gloomy actually out today, but thank you all for joining me. I'm really excited to talk with you about some of the work from my book project. And so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides for you all. Okay, so hopefully you all can see that. If not, just let me know. As Dr. Schatz mentioned, I'm going to be talking about, in pretty broad strokes, my ongoing book project that examines how non-democracies use nominally democratic communication strategies. So something that kind of looks democratic on the surface, but is actually used to shore up the existing regime. And so essentially what this book asks is how and why and non-democracies engage citizens, at least nominally, in the political process and conversation. And so the core of the book focuses on the case of Russia, and particularly one specific tool used by the Putin administration, the direct line with Vladimir Putin. I'm sure some of you have heard of this before. It's an extremely popular annual call-in program where Putin takes calls from people around Russia and discusses various issues of the day. Everything from increasing the price of housing utilities to infrastructure and economic and foreign policy. Now, I did not set out to write an entire book on a TV show on this call-in program, but as I started to look into more and how non-democracies communicate with citizens and kind of pull them into the political process, I realized that this type of strategy is pretty common around the world. So one of the most famous of these is Allo Presidente, which some of you may have heard of. So this is a program that ran from 1999 to 2012, and it was a weekly talk show hosted by Hugo Chavez, as you can see in the photo. And during this program, Hugo Chavez would travel around the country, talk to people about their problems, make ad hoc policies. If you have not seen this, I would highly recommend doing so. It is absolutely wild and is a great, Friday night in quarantine. So we have examples in Russia and Venezuela. Singapore actually also has a very long history of this type of two-way interaction between citizens and leaders. Most recently, they've created kind of a new age, new tech version of this called Reach, which, according to the website, aims to create a level of openness between the government and Singaporeans, working together to establish continued conversations, community participation, and collaboration. So again, this kind of idea that people have some way to communicate and talk with the government and have their concerns heard. Just one final example, one of my favorites. There's this program in China called Share Your Thoughts with Premier Li, where throughout the year, people can type in the website any questions or concerns that they have. And as you can see from this wonderful little graphic, they are then sent to Premier Li, and he answers them in a live broadcast. So these are all instances of what I call participatory technologies. And all this means is these are strategies that are focused on elite mass communication that specifically foster some type of two-way interaction between ordinary people and their leaders in the government. And so what I'm doing in this book, I'm asking essentially why do autocrats bother doing this? What do they get out of it? And does it have an impact on how citizens view the government? So before we get into the case itself, I want to kind of step back and talk about some of the problems that autocrats face and how autocrats can overcome these problems through the use of participatory technologies. So as we know, challenges to non-democracies can come either from the elites or the masses. I am very much in my research interested to how governments discuss and deal with problems from the masses. So in order to secure their rule, autocrats have really two important problems that I discuss in the book that they need to overcome, that of information and legitimacy. So attaining accurate information about community society is very much a necessary condition for long-term stability. The more information that governments have about society, the more able they are to identify specific areas of concerns before it boils over and creates instability in the country. And second, autocrats essentially just have to ensure that the population to some extent buys into the system, that citizens believe that the existing order, to use Shinja's terms, is appropriate and proper. Now, these problems are very much intertwined. I think it's important to think of them as kind of two sides of the same coin. So in order to build and gauge legitimacy of a population, governments need to have detailed information about society. However, unlike democratic rulers who benefit from the institutionalization of things like free, fair, and competitive elections, non-democracies kind of have to look for alternative strategies to help gain information and manufacture consent of the society. So what I'm essentially looking at is how do they balance the needs for control on one hand and popular legitimacy and support on the other. Now, just as an aside, there are a lot of tools that non-democracies have at their disposal. There's an incredibly rich literature that looks at a number of different strategies, everything from elections to legislatures and courts and so on. I kind of add another in my book and look at specifically these participatory technologies and how it can act as another tool in the larger toolkits that autocrats have available. And so what I argue in the book is that by providing these opportunities for non-electoral participation in what is in otherwise relatively closed political systems, these participatory technologies can help strengthen the flow of vertical information, so that is information from citizens to governments and from governments to citizens, and can help demonstrate to citizens that the authorities are attentive to their needs, concerns, and mood. So moreover, actually before we get started, so moreover, they mimic more democratic forms of participation, but they do so without necessarily the constraints of more formal institutions. So these are what Lucier calls elite enabling patterns of participation, in that they help generate support without necessarily requiring responsiveness or putting really any constraints on elite behavior. And so by promoting such strategies, autocrats encourage citizens to believe that they have a role in politics, that citizens have the opportunity to communicate to the government their needs, concerns, and opinions. So it kind of bridges the distance between people on the ground and leaders, what Adeed calls virtual immediacy. And it does so while still maintaining the control and the means of the communication. So essentially what I'm arguing is that autocrats are presenting this facade of democratic governance and accountability in order to boost perceptions of voice, improve views of the autocrats, while at the same time, kind of strengthening their regime. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus kind of on part 2 here, so this legitimacy portion. And the book is split up into 2 halves. The first is talking about this information management, and the second on legitimacy. I am more than happy to talk more about the information management further in the Q&A if you'd like to discuss it. Okay, now the fun stuff, the actual case, the direct line with Vladimir Putin. So this program, as I mentioned, it began in 2001 and it has continued every year, essentially to this day, only missing 3 years, 2004, 2012, and 2020. So Peskov just announced a few weeks ago that Putin would not have the direct line this year. And if you're interested in why they didn't have it for these 3 years, I'd also be willing to talk about this in the Q&A. It's actually quite fascinating. And so the direct line is actually incredibly popular. In its very first year, in 2001, according to various surveys, around 70% of people said that they watched at least some of the broadcast. I asked the same question again in a survey that I conducted in 2016. And while viewership has gone down over the years as it's become more routinized and people get kind of bored of the same old thing, it's still incredibly popular. So about 45% of my sample said that they watched at least some of the broadcast. So to put this in comparison to some of Putin's other major speeches, the address to the Federal Assembly that he does every year, that typically pulls in a viewership around 8 to 25%. So like less than half that the direct line does. It's actually been named on multiple occasions one of the 10 most important events that has occurred in the world in open-ended questions in any particular year, beating out Brexit, the World Cup, and Russia's parliamentary elections. So moral of the story, it's very well known, it's very popular. And so while 45% of people watch it, what's even more interesting, I think, is that 99% of people actually know about it. Even if they're not actively watching it, at least they have heard of it before, or at least know what's going on. And allegedly, even as viewership has gone down over the years, allegedly the number of questions asked has increased quite a bit, from less than 500,000 in the first year to roughly anywhere between 2.5 to 3 million in recent years. And I say allegedly here because we don't actually get to see all of the questions. These are the numbers that the organizers promote into the public, but they don't actually make available all the questions. So we're not entirely sure. But this is at least the number that is publicized. Now, if the purpose of these particular tools is to present them as a way to essentially bridge the gap between leaders and citizens, to give people a chance to communicate with the government, it needs to be seen as authentic. It has to be seen as a genuine form of communication, right? This could not be simply 4 hours of people calling in and telling Putin how great he is, or asking him, if you had a goldfish that was magical and you could make a wish to, what would you wish for? Which, yes, was an actual question that was asked one year. So it can't all simply be fawning questions that don't deal with the topics of the day, because then nobody would buy into this, it wouldn't be convincing. So in order to see what were the topics and what were the tones of the question, I analyzed all 1,143 question-answer pairings for all the questions asked live on the direct line from 2001 to 2017. And I found some really interesting things here. So here on your screen, you see on the left, the percentage of the total questions asked in this period by broad topic area. Foreign affairs, the economy, domestic politics, social issues. In this category I called Putin, which are these questions like the goldfish, or do you like the banya? How many hours of sleep do you get at night? And then right here, you can see more detail into the types of actual topics that are asked. And what we see here is that the questions and the topics are very similar to what you see on surveys and when you ask people as being the most important problems and concerns in society. Things like healthcare, housing, wages, pension, education. So on its surface, it does appear that the direct line is indeed asking the types of questions that people are interested in learning about and that are important to them personally for their daily lives. However, it's not just important to talk about the issues that people care about, but in order for this to be convincing, they can't simply be, thanking Putin for solving a housing crisis or talking about how good of a job that the government does for education. People have problems and concerns with these areas. And so in order for this to be, again, authentic and convincing for people, you have to have acknowledgement that everything's not necessarily okay all the time. And so in addition to looking just at the content of the questions, I looked at their tone. And I essentially divided the questions all into one of 4 categories. Positive questions, which are essentially questions that are thanking the government or talking about the government doing something good for people. So the example you see on your screen here, it's saying, I want to express gratitude to Putin for assistance. Topics could also be, tones could also be negative. So really a great example of this. A question that was asked in 2014 was very pointed and asked Putin directly, why are you pursuing a policy that hurts people? Do you want us all to starve to death? So questions that are almost anti-government, that are really calling out the government for not doing their job. Then you have neutral questions, which are just essentially informational questions. And another category I ended up adding, because there are enough of these, questions that are pleading, that are like actively saying, there's something serious going on, we really need your help. And so in order for this to be an authentic form of communication, or at least to be portrayed as an authentic form of communication, we can't have everything be in this first positive category. And so what I find is that while the majority of questions are typically just neutral, they're just asking for information, what's really interesting is that over double the amount of questions are actively negative, are actively critical of the government, as opposed to positive. So we see nearly 20% of them are negative, as opposed to 8 are more positive and like thanking the government. And so this is important, right? Because again, the point of these is to be seen as a genuine form of communication. And Putin has been extremely explicit that this is supposed to be the purpose of the direct line. So when he was asked at the very first direct line why he's bothering to do this, he said, well, I think this is an important form of dialogue. It's a way for me to listen to my people and give some feedback, right? So that there needs to be some type of communication, some type of dialogue. And some people do tend to buy into this. So I did also, for this project, about 45 interviews and focus groups in order to kind of gauge what people are thinking about this on the ground. And quite a few individuals, actually, when I asked them about what's the purpose of the direct line, they said, this is a way for us to, talk to the government, to call in and give our opinions. And so for Putin to find out problems directly from the source. So for some people, it does seem to be working. Of course, not everybody buys that the direct line is a form of voice, right? As many people as say, yes, this is a way for us to talk to Putin. You have people saying, no, this is just a performance. This is just a way for Putin to earn points from society. It doesn't actually change anything. It's just a circus. Everything is staged. So we have this kind of tension here between some people viewing this as a form of voice, and then some people seeing it as, this is just propaganda. And so I asked in one of my surveys, I had about 1,600 respondents here, and I said, so what do you think the purpose of the direct line? And when we see kind of what I was talking about before, right? A plurality of individuals do say that the purpose is for the government to kind of talk to society, to learn about their concerns, or alternatively to inform society about their policies. But not a trivial amount of people said, this is just to improve Putin's ratings, right? Doesn't mean anything, it's not useful, it's just to make Putin appear popular. And as we can see for that line as well, there seems to be an increase in the number of people over the years. And so this is going to be important. I'll come back to this figure later. So while on the surface, there does seem to be convincing some individuals that this is a genuine form of voice, I really wanted to dive in and see, does the direct line actually influence approval of Putin and people's own views of the efficacy of their ability to participate in politics? And so to do so, I conducted 2 surveys and embedded 2 survey experiments in these. So both of these surveys were implemented by the Levada Analytical Center, so the most prominent and well-respected survey and research company in the country. The first one, which I'm going to introduce you to, specifically gets at this part of, does the direct line and awareness of the direct line influence approval? And so this was I commissioned as a part of the Levada Omnibus survey. It's a monthly survey that you can embed questions in. It's nationally representative, has about an end of around 1,600. And I conducted this a few weeks before the 2016 broadcast. The second experiment I'm going to introduce to you is courtesy, I have to thank Theodore Gerber and James Dawisha, who allowed me to include this in their comparative housing experience and social stability survey, which we conducted about 6 months or so after the direct line in 2015. So this was a survey of around 2,400 individuals. Okay, so both of these surveys, experiments, are what are called priming experiments. And so the purpose of priming experiments is that you ask about, say, half of your respondents a question, and before that you introduce the topic of interest. So in this case, the direct line. And then for the other half of people, you just ask them the question. You don't introduce the direct line. And the idea here is that any change that we see for the answer to this question, in this case, approval of Putin, is going to be attributed to the mention of the direct line. There are always criticisms of these types of methods. I'd be happy to talk about them further. So let's look at the first experiment, the one that looks at approval of Putin. So for this experiment, what I do is I have 4 different primes, different pieces of information I give people. And they vary along 2 different dimensions. One, whether or not they mention the existence of the direct line, and 2, whether or not essentially the issue that I talk about in the prime was actually solved. So everyone gets the same information that starts, recently, one of the managers of a housing company sharply increased the price of utilities. And President Putin then promised to look into the issue. Half of the respondents are just told that the president is looking into the issue. Half of them are told that he found out about the issue during the direct line. So what I would expect here is that when I ask my main question, to what extent do you approve or disapprove of the way President Putin is handling his job as president, the people who received the direct line mention are going to express higher levels of approval. You may notice that I also changed something else in this experiment. That is whether or not the issue was resolved. Were the prices lowered or were they not lowered? And I do this for an important purpose. So one of the reasons why the direct line may be effective at improving views of Putin is if people actually are getting their way. So is there any output legitimacy? Or is performance changing? And this is an extremely common tactic on the direct line. People will call in with a question, and then at some point later in the broadcast, the organizers will stop the proceedings and say, we have some breaking news. We just found out that, the governor has promised to solve the issue and we're working on it now. So oftentimes they'll actively say that their problem is getting solved in the middle of the direct line. So I wanted to kind of get us close to reality and see if this is actually effective as well. So one of the examples that is perhaps one of the most infamous examples from the direct line is in 2016, the very first broadcast, the very first question of the broadcast was a woman in Omsk. She was had like her video phone on and was talking about problems of the roads. So later on, we are informed that actually the roads are getting fixed. So on the left, you see a tweet that I was able to screenshot. This was about an hour into the program, and the tweet reads, "You don't believe, but this is Omsk right now," essentially implying that somebody asked about the question on the direct line and Putin was on it, and so he solved it right away. This led to a lot of hilarity, and there were a number of memes that came out of this example. So on the right is one of my favorites. So the right image shows on the left, Omsk before the direct line. And as you see, there's not a lot of development. And then to the right of that, you see a comical level of development with Omsk after the direct line. Okay, so I am mainly concerned with this mention of the direct line. That is kind of the purpose for our talk today, but I'm also going to discuss the influence of prices are lowered versus not lowered. Okay, so again, I expect that when people hear about the direct line, they are more likely to approve for Putin, express higher approval, and the same for going from prices were not lowered to prices were lowered. Here are our results. So I have on the left the mean results for no direct line. So primes 1 and 2, which is in the gray, and then primes 3 and 4 in the dark gray on the left, and then for resolution on the right. And so what we see here is that at first brush, it does look like mentioning the direct line was effective. So we see an increase of approximately 0.10 units on a 5-point scale, which translate into a 3 percentage point increase in approval. So this is simply by mentioning the direct line, right? I'm not giving any information about the program. I'm not, telling people that it's, doing a good job. I'm not linking the issue resolution to the direct line in any way. This is simply just asking this question, mentioning the direct line, and relying on people's own views. We also see a pretty dramatic increase in the no resolution to resolution environments. So this is roughly a 14% point increase in approval. And so while at first blush, it may seem that the issue resolution has an outside effect, you have to remember that this is a much stronger treatment. We are essentially going from the government doesn't care about you and isn't solving your problems to they actively are going and creating policies that benefit society. And moreover, what's interesting here is that these two treatments, they are completely independent of each other. So what that means is that the effect of the direct line persists regardless of whether or not the issue was resolved. So whether or not people received this positive outcome or not. And what this suggests is that the influence of direct line on approval is not actually contingent on whether or not people get what they want. It's simply contingent on having the opportunity, the ability to talk about their problems. So, but I want to dig into this idea a little bit more deeply. So if the direct line, I asked essentially, is it effective at making people think that the government's actually listening to them, that they have some role in society? And so this leads me to my second experiment, which looks specifically at to what extent people agree or disagree with the statement that in our country, there are opportunities and ways to convey to the government the opinions, needs, and demands of ordinary citizens. And what I expect is that people who are, when I mention the direct line to people before this, they are more likely to say that they approve of this statement, that they agree with the statement, than if I do not ask about the direct line. So half of my respondents are simply asked if they have heard about the direct line before. Again, no additional information is given. I'm just bringing this to the top of their mind so that they consider it when answering the question. So the results here aren't quite as strong as in the first experiment. While the mean does move in the expected direction, so from 3.12 to 3.19, it does fall short of conventional standards of statistical significance. So basically what it says is maybe not, it's maybe not super effective. However, I want you to remind you of this figure that I said was going to come back around. I don't expect everybody to buy into this, right? Some people, as we see in this graph, actually think that the direct line is a way for the government to learn about citizens' concerns. But a number of people think that, no, it's really not. It's just a form of propaganda, and it's not really a way for us to do anything. It's just to improve Putin's ratings. So if you remember Maxime and Andre from earlier. Maxime here thinks that this is a way for people to give their opinions. Andre is much more skeptical. So what I expect is that whether or not people are believing that this is a genuine form of voice is going to be conditional on their level of political sophistication and political priors. So by political sophistication here, what I mean is, are you interested in politics? Do you vote? Do you participate in politics in any way? And what I would expect is that people who are more politically sophisticated are going to be less convinced by this strategy. People with lower levels of political sophistication are more likely to be like, oh, look, this is a really great way for me to talk with the government. And so for us to see a positive effect there. And then I also expect essentially the people's views of the general views and attitudes toward the government is going to influence their opinions. So people who are pro-regime, who are trusting of Putin, are more likely to take it at the direct line at its face value and say, yes, this is a way to communicate with the government. Whereas people who are already skeptical of the government, who think that the government is not caring about their citizens, are just going to dismiss it, and they're just going to say, this is propaganda, it doesn't matter. So I've essentially broken up the world into believers, which I call people with low political sophistication and pro-regime priors, and our skeptics, the ones that I don't really expect to see an impact on. So then I go back to my experiment number 2 that looks at this question of voice, to see if we do see different patterns and different responses for each of these categories. Okay, so before I show you, describe what the results are, I just want to tell you how to interpret this graph. So I have broken up political sophistication in 3 categories. Low political sophistication, which means don't really vote, don't participate in politics, don't care about politics. Moderate and high, which means yes, I participate, yes, I care about politics. And then our last 2 categories here, do not trust Putin. These are our anti-regime people who trust Putin, pro-regime. And so this vertical line at 0, this is going to tell us what is the effect for each of these groups from going from not the direct line to the direct line. So being told about the direct line, what's the impact? And so what we find for people with our believers, the people with lower political sophistication and who trust the government, we see a pretty significant actually increase in their perceptions of voice, whether or not they believe that the government cares about their opinions. So this goes about 17 percentage points increase for people with low sophistication and about 8 percentage point increase for people who trust Putin. So for our skeptics, however, it's a little bit more interesting here. As expected, people who are very politically sophisticated, they just kind of dismiss this whole thing. It's not important. And so their opinions don't really change. However, what's really interesting here, which I did not expect to find, is that for these people who have anti-regime opinions, who don't trust Putin, who don't really think the government cares about them, they're not just dismissing this as like yet another form of propaganda. Rather, it is actively decreasing their perceptions of the government, decreasing their views that there are ways to communicate with the government. And so what this tells us is that participatory technologies are not only failing to convert regime skeptics, but they might actually reinforce and reify existing anti-regime sentiments. So these skeptics are much more likely to interpret participatory technologies simply as a performance, as a circus, like we saw before, as an attempt by the government to manipulate the public. Whereas we are seeing the most positive effect on public opinions, mainly for these believers, lower political sophistication and trusting of Putin. So this research leads to some important implications. First, what I show here is that these participatory technologies, things that we typically kind of just laugh off, they're not just window dressing. They actually serve important purposes for the regime, both in gathering information from society, but also in swaying and changing public opinion. And so this is particularly important because these strategies are extremely cheap. The direct line takes 4 hours of Putin's time and some organization, by the organizers, but it really doesn't take a lot of time or resources on the part of the government. So they get a lot of bang for their buck for these strategies. However, it does have the potential to backfire, right? And to strengthen existing negative opinions of the government. So when I was doing the survey, it really wasn't that significant. We had about 90% of the sample trusted Putin compared to 10% who didn't. But what this indicates is that if this group of people who distrust Putin grows over time, there could be a serious potential for backlash. And this is indeed something that I saw come up again and again in a lot of my interviews. People who were originally very enthusiastic about the program have started to become disappointed and discontented as time goes on and nothing changes, right? This idea that this is just a formality, that we've been asking the same questions for 15 years and nothing has changed, was really very present in the interviews. So as discontent with the direct line grows and the government fails to convince Russians that it actually leads to any substantive change, I expect the efficacy of the direct line as a tool for manufacturing consent to wane. Okay, so I will stop there and open the floor up to questions. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that fantastic presentation. There's a lot that's on the table, and I love how you link up what's both a familiar story to those of us who pay attention to Russia to a broader set of cases that are out there that presumably you're not in your book looking at Singapore or China, but others may be working on these sorts of similar kinds of topics, right?
Yeah, so I do in my conclusion do like shorter shadow case studies of these different programs in various countries. I don't give them the attention that I give the direct line, of course, but there are an increase in scholarship on these topics, both the direct line, so I'm thinking of Evans and Mingle's paper, and Gaddy also talked about this, as well as work in China in particular that is really starting to consider these different strategies.
Yeah. So let me start off the questioning. I mean, I'm sure we'll see more questions come in. Feel free. I sent a note around. Hopefully, it went to everybody in the audience to write your questions. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you write something, it will go to the panel, and we'll have a chance to see it, and we'll ask as many questions as we possibly can. It's not clear to me if you'll see the question once you've sent it, but have faith. It has gone. Be a believer. It has gone to us. So let me start off the questions, and it may be that your research, at least much of what you presented today, I think focused more on the individual level, Russian citizens, which is a nice sort of way to remind us, or it's a nice reminder that, yeah, guess what? Russian citizens are citizens too, with minds of themselves. They're not simply victims of an autocratic regime with no agency. They may be victims, but they also have agency. And to think about the kinds of choices that they make, even in a context where media are saturated by pro-regime messages, I mean, that's a quite a welcome sort of move. But if I wanted to move away, I think my questions will sort of move away from the individual level, because I think that gets us to questions about sort of Russian politics and some of the things about where this is all going. What is your sense about let me just ask two quick questions. What is your sense about the extent to which the efficacy of this effort depends upon the human being of Vladimir Putin, right? And I ask that not because, well, I mean, we know Putin's going to live forever, so maybe this is an academic question, but maybe he's going to decline in his ability to be at the top of his game, right? Because that happens to aging autocrats. So to what extent do some of the effects that you see, do you think, and you may not have studied it, but I'd be curious for you to speculate, does it depend on this particular individual? I imagine, because I'm spending a lot of time obsessing about the American politics right now, I'm imagining Donald Trump in this similar kind of role, and I just don't see him having at his fingertips all of the dimensions of policy that that Putin is better at. I won't say he's perfect, but he certainly has it at his command. So that's the first question: to what extent does it depend on Vladimir Putin, the person? The second question is really about possibly a different function for this, and it doesn't call into question anything that you've found. But one of the things that we know about media in authoritarian contexts is that, yeah, sure, they're trying to communicate things, potentially establish legitimacy. But if you look at Lisa Wedeen's work, for example, it's also about just occupying public space, right? Cluttering the public space so that other ways of discussing politics or discussing policy get nudged away. So it ends up not being so much, do people believe, or are they believers, or are they skeptics? Do they buy it or do they not? It's just that really, well, when the direct line with Vladimir Putin is on, that's what's on TV, right? You end up it sort of nudges alternatives to the side. So those are my two questions to get us started, and love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on some really important points. So the first question about, is this really just a Putin thing? Would it work for anybody else? So it's true that a large part of this is about portraying Putin in certain lights. He is a man of the people. He is a very competent technocrat. There's always remarks like, wow, I'm so impressed by all of the statistics that Putin was able to discuss on the program. Most of them are wrong, but it still looks very convincing. So what I try to do a little bit in the experiments is say, is this just a Putin effect? Is it only because, I'm bringing up Putin again and again? And so what I kind of do to mitigate this a little bit in the experiments is I mention him in every question. So we can kind of put that a little bit to the side. But I don't think that this makes this any less important, right? A big function of this is actually portraying Putin in a certain light. However, what I think is really important about this and makes a big part of the book I really didn't get to today is I'm not just looking at people who watch this, right? It is a big chunk of the population, 45% of people, but most people don't listen to the direct line. They don't watch it, so they're not actually getting the content. Rather, what they know about it is they know the general idea of the program. Okay, so it's where Putin goes and sits and talks to people. And so what I am seeing here is I'm seeing an effect for essentially anybody who knows about it, whether or not they're actually actively watching this and seeing how Putin portrays himself on the direct line. That being said, this would not go on as long as it has, as Putin was not as effective as he is. In fact, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan tried to do something. In fact, he called it the direct line with Sultan Nazarbayev for a number of years. It was not very impressive, one might say. People really didn't care about this, and he kind of pushed it off on his ministers later on down the road because simply he didn't have this charismatic figure that Putin has. And so it wasn't nearly as effective for him as it would be for someone like Hugo Chavez or Putin himself. So I think that is a very important part of this, is how he's portrayed and his ability to go online or on the TV for 4 hours and talk off the cuff, right? And second is this an important part of this is occupying the public space, right? Yes, I think this is a key function of the direct line. Again, I don't really care so much about people who watch it versus people who don't. I'm seeing similar effects across the board. But a key function of the direct line is to give the government as much control as possible over the political conversation, right? They're saying, yes, you can call into the Putin, you can talk to him, you can have some say in what topics are being discussed, but clearly it is staged. Clearly, even just if you were as much of a believer as a believer you could be, there's 2.5 million questions being asked. Of course they pick the questions. Of course they are controlling the content that is being used. And this is a critical point of the direct line. And for these participatory technologies to be effective in shoring up non-democracies, they have to still be in the government's control. if the government loses control, if they are not able to, occupy the public space as effectively, then these won't be as effective either.
Well, that's great. I mean, it reminds me of some of the work that I've read on the media in China.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you see the parallels where it's like, the possibility is that this is actually an opportunity when we think about critical of the government. And it's interesting, we sort of say, well, why would they let in these questions that are critical of the government? Well, if that presents an opportunity for Putin in this case to reshuffle his cabinet, to come down on a particular minister, to come down on a particular region, right? And you certainly see that in the Chinese case, right? That this is that you sometimes you really actually want to talk about corruption selectively so that you can continue to manage this complex, political field. So I don't know if you see that. Let me actually, I'm sorry. Let me throw in a couple more questions because I don't want to monopolize this. The questions are coming in. I'm going to turn to Monty McMurchie. Sorry, if you don't want me to mention your name, then please say so in the Q&A. Who asks a kind of a version of the one that I was asking about occupying public space, but with more of an attention to emotions. In other words, what if we thought about the direct line as a way to, I don't know, tug at the heartstrings of the Russian citizen, right? Maybe drum up patriotism in key moments. Where you certainly saw that. I remember watching the direct line right after the annexation of Crimea, right?
That's exactly what I mentioned, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, so you certainly see that. So maybe it's less about solving people's problems and more it's about let me put it most baldly, manipulating them emotionally. And I wonder if you see that.
Totally, right? Like, and if you think about, is it about solving people's problems? I mean, really, no. If it was about solving people's problems, they would make policy that solved people's problems. It wouldn't be this old babushka, in a region somewhere, we now made sure she got her pensions. That's kind of the clever part about it, is it's not actually enforcing any type of responsiveness because they're so selective. But is it about emotions? Absolutely. There's actually some really good work on this. I think Pisano has written some great stuff about how the direct line can be used to foment essentially nation building and national opinion. And I think the example of the podcast after Crimea is exactly right. That was the only year where there was more content about foreign policy issues than domestic policy issues, because Putin was using this very much as a way to discuss the things that he wanted to discuss. Right? He has complete control of the conversation, whether or not they portray it that way or not. What it comes down to, he is able to essentially pick the topics and use it in order to essentially tug on people's heartstrings. I think that's right. The types of questions that are like old women who really need help and Putin is there and he cares about them. This is, I think, incredibly important. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. I want to go back to your question about, so is this also a way to, kind of talk about on the government's control about kind of corruptions in officials? And that's actually what I talk about in the first half of my book when I talk about more of this information management. And since you brought it up, I'm going to share one of my favorite, I think very illustrative, it goes all the way to the back here, let me do this, examples of why this is an important function. All right, so during the direct line, very often people will bring up like my governor in my region hasn't been paying attention to these problems. And so if we know anything about the principal agent problem, Putin really needs to doesn't really have a good idea of what's going on the ground because all of his information is coming by, the officials in the middle level. So this is a really useful way to essentially have the largest sociological poll to find out exactly what people are thinking and exactly the problems that they are having and which of his officials are not doing their job. So there's this, if you read Russian, if you don't, so this is a very popular meme that goes around every year on the direct line. And it says, what is essentially the comparative speed of a bullet, which is slower than light, which is even slower than official really hurrying to get his duties done before the beginning of the direct line. And what this is trying to imply is that officials are essentially, they're scared about their problems being brought up in the direct line because this is a way for Putin to selectively call out corruption at the lower levels, or to call out particular officials so that he can essentially pass blame and get a ton of information that they would not, the federal government would not have otherwise.
Excellent. Yeah, we actually have a question. People are sort of anticipating in their question some of the things that you're getting to, so that's terrific. Stephen Yet asks, is the direct line a way for Putin to overcome principal agent problems? He's specifically looking at he says city governments also have equivalent channels for information aggregation. Let me ask another question from Stephen, and then continually fold in some of my own. Stephen asks, is the distrust towards local officials deflected onto Putin? Are there any surveys that compare trust and distrust towards Putin, localities, and the Kremlin as a whole? So that's a question. And then let me actually mention another question related, because I think you have to kind of tackle these in the same breath if you can. Megan Kelly asks, what are the challenges of conducting public opinion research within the authoritarian context? In other words, I mean, you rely on the Levada Center, you commissioned your own stuff. We know that this stuff is being managed. We know that citizens are conditioned in particular ways when to answer. You know, not to say we shouldn't go out and get the best information we possibly can, but what can you say about the information that goes into either your study or into the calculations of somebody in the Kremlin?
Yeah. So first off, the question about trust for Putin versus officials. That's interesting. I don't know of any surveys that get at this specifically, but this is definitely something that came up a lot in my interviews over and over, which is people see that they're very dissatisfied with local government officials, and they say no, they don't get anything done. Nothing changes. And so that is why we have the direct line, because this is the only way we can actually get anything done is if it goes directly to Putin. And this is actually one of the reasons why you could see it becoming less effective over time as well. Because if nothing is changing, if you're constantly pleading to Putin and still nothing's changing, that brings down essentially views of not only your local government, who you don't care about because they're not doing anything in anyways, but also Putin, the guy who's supposed to then take over and solve things, but don't, right? This came up again and again. Even the people who really liked the direct line, who wanted more of it, who thought this was a great tool, they're like, but we've been doing this for nearly 20 years and I haven't noticed any change. So what's going on? So the question about challenges of surveys and finding out public opinion. So this is a question that political scientists really concern ourselves with. It is really hard to collect good on the ground data in authoritarian regimes, because there is always this concern that people are not going to talk about their opinions honestly. Personally, I have never experienced this, having spent a lot of time in Russia. As soon as they know I'm an American, they're like, let me tell you about my opinions. So my own personal experiences doing these interviews and focus groups and doing a lot of field work in Russia, I am pretty confident that what people are telling me is the truth. They tell me a lot more information about their opinions of the government than maybe I would even like to know. But on a more aggregate level, can we trust surveys? So I have a lot of faith, specifically in Levada. They are very professional. I've worked with them for many years. I've been on the ground when they've done these things. But also there have been studies that explicitly look at, is there any bias? Are people actually telling the truth? So probably the best paper for this is by Fry et al. 2016, that specifically looks at, do surveys get at the actual opinions of people in Russia, considering these difficulties of studying public opinion in non-democracies? And what they find is that there's very little bias in people's response. So it does seem to be that people are actually being truthful. And that really does track with my experience on the ground.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, as with everything, this is a moving target, right? So one of the things that we know about Russian politics today, you know far better than I do, is that it's that the space for these kinds of things is being continually shaped. I'm sure that the other half of your book, you know, deals with this sort of shrinking space, but people were socialized in you know, the wild 1990s, where you could say lots of things, and you still see the residue of that. My question, this is an open question, I don't know if you can comment on it at all, maybe your research doesn't get into it, but will we begin to see that the gap between what they say to the pollster and what they might, you know, actually believe in private grow as the space for free expression in Russia shrinks, assuming that you agree that that's the path that we seem to be traveling on. I don't know. I mean, the overtime question is really fascinating, because I remember at one point, I can't remember why, but I went, and I'm glad you did the research, because I really wanted to, and I found it super time consuming and exhausting. But I went through the direct lines just to get a sense of them over the years, and even the style changes, right? And I mean, certainly 2014, but it now it feels way less spontaneous. It feels much more cultivated, and I can see how a bit of cynicism might begin to creep into sort of the Russian body politic more than there already, you know, already is. So those are just a couple of comments. Let me turn to some questions from the audience. Where was I? Okay, Diana Fu asks, I wonder if the president's direct line is kind of akin to mayor's hotline in China. Did another audience member mention that there's also similar direct lines in Russia at a city level? Right, so that's one quick question about the Chinese case. And Michael Campbell Thompson asks, can you comment on a similar reported phenomenon when Russian citizens appealed to Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, to shed light on local issues to raise awareness? Which is, in a way, I mean, if you haven't answered that question, it's a way to get to, you know, how much does what you see depend on the particular individual who's running the show in each case.
Yep. So what about the other similar systems in Russia and in China? Yeah, like actually in Russia, a lot of governors started doing direct lines in response to Putin doing direct lines because they were so popular. They aren't quite, I mean, they're not quite as popular, obviously, as it would be for Putin, just Putin being the head honcho and the most popular figure. They're not advertised as well because these regional governors don't have the budget that Putin does. But this is very much, we see a lot of copycatting. You know, I mentioned in Kazakhstan, it's also happening in Russia as well, because I think people are seeing this, leaders are seeing this as an opportunity to gather information about society and to kind of set the political conversation. So yes, we're seeing a lot of this around the world. And again, Putin wasn't the first. Right? A lot of earlier work makes a connection between Chavez doing it originally and then Putin kind of doing it as well, looking at what Chavez did. So this is not a Russia-only phenomenon. This is something we see basically everywhere. The content, like the actual how it looks, is going to be different. Every political context is different. What works in China won't work in Russia. So that varies. But this idea of connecting citizens with their leaders is something that we see increasingly in most authoritarian regimes. So the point of Kadyrov, so I wonder if they're talking about specifically, so he did this through his Instagram, I believe. And so, yeah, so I actually, gosh, who did it? I'm blanking on, but there's some excellent work on Kadyrov and his Instagram. And there is evidence that this was very much trying to do a similar type of system in Chechnya as Putin was doing in the long stage. So yes, that is my very long and short answer is yes, this is something that we see a lot. There's a lot of copycatting, explicit copycatting going on. And then a lot of just, I think, non-democracies realizing that, you know, in the age where democracy has won, to use the famous quote, you have to look at ways to essentially convince people that, you know, the government is there and that they have a role in government. You know, this is not an age where repression and co-optation is going to keep authoritarian regimes alive. You have to look for these more innovative ways to keep your legitimacy, essentially.
No, that's great. I mean, we sort of caught up a little bit on the questions. Keep them coming if you're interested. I will follow up on that with. I mean, I guess it leads to a couple of questions. One is, do we know of cases where something like this? Obviously, you know, there are variations on the theme if you take a global sort of view, but where something like this has failed. I'm just sort of thinking about what's on my mind recently, which is Belarus, and I'm thinking about Lukashenko, and I don't know that he's done anything like this. It would surprise me very much if he had done something like this, and I wonder if there's any way to know where the returns become so diminishing that you might call it, you know, kind of a failed sort of exercise, or do they just cancel the show and so no one really knows that it's actually failed?
So I think this my arguments that I made today can kind of help us understand like what might be the future, like when might we see failure, right? So this heterogeneous effect of it working for some people and not for others, I think can tell us, you know, if we get to a point where people just are not trusting of the government at all, right? If they're all in the skeptic category, then first off, people are not going to go ahead and ask questions, which reduces the managing information benefit of these. And then nobody's going to buy into it and watch it and care about what gets said. It's not going to influence their views of the government. So we see this already happening a little bit in Russia. We see people getting really tired of it, and it seems to be becoming less effective over time. So you mentioned earlier that after 2012, it started getting more staged. Well, the reason for that is, you know, as we know, in 2011, Putin's ratings were very low. This was right after the fraudulent Duma elections. And the whole 2011 broadcast was essentially the organizers, but also the callers coming back on, what are you going to do about this? Why are the elections fraudulent? Like really hammering on Putin. And because it was so negative and like Putin's performance was very poor, they have had to kind of change it to have a less spontaneous nature so something like this doesn't occur. So what we might expect to see is that if support is already really low, like you might see in Belarus, that leaders wouldn't even bother doing this to start out with, because like anti-regime sentiment is so high that it's not going to have the benefits in the first place.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes sense. I guess, you know, it's sort of in the background is one's theoretical expectations about why people would shift from being believers to being skeptics, or from being enough of a believer to really, really a skeptic. And maybe that is sort of external to what you're considering here, but it seems like that's operating in the background. Just to clarify, so Michael Campbell Thompson on the Kadyrov Chechen example, he says, to clarify, this is when Central Russian citizens from places like Kemerovo and other oblasts turn to Kadyrov's Instagram because they have no chance to reach Putin through the direct line as the more accessible option. I guess you know, they have an alternative. Kadyrov is the more accessible
right.
direct line to Ramzan Kadyrov.
But I believe that Instagram has actually deleted Kadyrov's account at this point.
Okay.
I don't want to speak for certain, but I heard that Kadyrov is no longer allowed to be on Instagram.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know what specifically he might have done, but that doesn't surprise me entirely that he might have done something deeply outrageous. So that makes total sense. I guess I wonder what's the sort of suite of other things that are happening in Russian society that are kind of you know, are aligned with this sort of participatory approach. I'm thinking about again, I'm not an expert in Russian politics, but what I've read about the efforts at, I'm trying to remember the term, sort of new public administration techniques, right? The idea, like big data sorts of things, like you can actually go on, like there's a lot that's automated. There's sort of the provision of public services, maybe of applications for licenses and all these kinds of things are in the interest of efficiency. If I remember correctly, there's been a huge drive there. And so it strikes me that in addition to any actual efficiencies that this produces in providing public goods, which is maybe a separate question, this is also part of that, of a messaging, right? It's, don't worry, general public, we're out there for you. We have, all you have to do is log on and, and so I'm wondering, are there other sort of, I guess, transmission belts, to use a very Soviet era kind of notion, transmission belts for the interests of the broader population that are similar, at least in theory, to the direct line?
Yeah, so there's things like the civic chamber where like society's representatives can go and talk to Putin about what people are talking about. But I like that you brought up. So these are called electronic government systems, e-gov systems. I actually did a Fulbright in Kazakhstan to study these specifically. And so if you remember Reach from the beginning of my talk, this is what this is as well. They're essentially these online portals, and they always have a variety of features. Some of them are, you apply for licenses, any of your like basic administrative tasks can be done online to kind of take out the middleman, reduce corruption. You no longer have to go in, pay a little bit of money under the table to get, your property values or what have you. But they also usually include some type of these forums where people can type in their policy problems, they can discuss policy proposals and the like. And so this is actually, Kazakhstan started with this direct line, and they actually moved to the government systems. And so now they have essentially public fora for each of the ministries in the country where people can go and talk to the ministers about these specific issues. And what's really interesting now is there's a new and growing, really interesting literature on these electronic government systems. One of the more interesting findings is that non-democracies tend to have more robust and better functioning electronic systems than many democracies do. And I think a large part of this is it does get rid of some of the low-level corruption that doesn't benefit the regime. But it's really an easy way to say, look, there are ways for people to, be involved, to talk about policy in a way that doesn't constrain government control. So this is becoming increasingly popular.
Excellent. I got a question here, another question looping back to Monty McMurtry. He asks about Carol Pateman in her book Participatory Democracy concludes that participatory civics is a myth, if not an outright fraud in politics. And I guess, which is really an interesting question. So is this phenomenon that you've identified, is it a feature? Is there less of a tension here? I mean, because in other words, is it a feature of authoritarian politics? And so to the extent that we actually see it emerging in democratic contexts with certain leaders using their Twitter feeds to circumvent normal media channels, that this is inherently a move in an authoritarian direction? Not sure that that's Monty's question, but I would sort of add that layer of complexity. In other words, can this be democratic?
Yeah. So I think that it is a feature of democracies in a way, right? The idea is that the idea of democracies is that people have a say in politics. And so what I think we're seeing here is non-democracies latching on to what they see as a democratic tool, as like a normal feature of democracies, but using it not to promote democracy, but actually to promote their own rule. And they can do this because these are elite enabling, right? To kind of the point of could we see this as a way for democracy to erode? Venezuela is an interesting case for that. In Venezuela, when Chavez started this, I think few scholars would have said that the country in 1999 was an authoritarian regime. But I think autocratically minded leaders can use these tools, and if they're used essentially as a substitute for more institutionalized forms of participation, saying you don't need to go vote, you don't need to participate in politics through institutions, rather, look, you have this great way to contact us directly, that can be used to weaken democratic institutions and kind of put countries on the path of authoritarianism, because you're essentially undermining the fundamental principles of democracy and opening up the political space to these types of participation that can be easily controlled and manipulated by the government.
Okay, really good. I mean, there's lots of very, very large questions. Very large country, not to say very important to follow. Let me ask one final sort of big question. I think at the beginning you started talking about framing this in terms of legitimacy, right? And I didn't hear that word in the latter part of the presentation, and it may be that I missed something, but I guess I wonder, how would we know if this was having any effect in terms of shoring up the legitimacy of an authoritarian regime? Like what would that look like? Is it a context where, we have a preponderance of believers over skeptics? I mean, is that how we know? Because I'm not entirely sure that deeply believing in the message of an authoritarian leader makes it legitimate. But one could parse that a little bit further. But I bet you don't think so, because one of the things that you described as characteristic of the believers is that they have low information, right? They're not sophisticated consumers of politics. So I guess I wonder, sort of, well, let me just leave it open to you. So how to answer that? Like, how would you know if this was having some kind of success in achieving legitimacy, or at least boosting the legitimacy of the regime?
So talking about legitimacy in general is always a very sticky subject, in particular when you're talking about legitimacy when it has to do with non-democracies. I know a lot of people think that non-democracies can't be legitimate. And so I always hesitate to use this word. I think in my book I use manufacturing consent as kind of an alternative. But I think when we think about legitimacy, there's a couple of important aspects, right? A government can be legitimate if essentially people buy into the process or buy into the outcome. So we can think of performance legitimacy and process legitimacy. So by performance legitimacy, is the government performing well for the people? And do people think that they're performing well? Versus process how the government functions, is governance itself seen as proper and like a good thing going on in the country? And so how I try to get at that is not so much in, the believers and the skeptics, but are we seeing any type of change in people approving of the government? Do they like the government and how it's functioning? And do they see the government as open to society? So that's what essentially my questions were in these experiments. And so what I try to argue is that if we're seeing a shift when people are essentially trying to think about these things, that we can interpret as when people are aware of the existence of these strategies, and we see that this awareness leads to greater perceptions of the government functioning for citizens, then that is what I interpret as being a form of increased legitimacy. But I absolutely take the point. It's a really sticky topic. It's not one that I'm fully satisfied with, for sure. But I'm really interested here in kind of, are we seeing any change in opinions? And I think the answer here is yes.
No, that's great. I mean, it's on my mind because just yesterday, you didn't know this, but just yesterday in my first year course on this stuff, we talked about Max Weber and legitimacy. Yeah. And so this is clearly on my mind. And only in a first year class can you present it as crisp, mutually exclusive categories. And when you get to real world contexts with real world, data, it becomes a much more complicated sort of sort of thing.
So,
I mean, what? Go ahead.
About this word too. So, and I am aware, and I can see this, but I think there's been a resurgence and thinking about non-democracies not as ruling through repression and cooptation, but actually trying to essentially get the people to buy in.
Sure.
And that's really where I see a lot of my work, and so I'm behind it. I think it has use.
Okay. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I mean, I guess I might throw in, just because I taught it yesterday, traditional forms of legitimacy, which are probably not the main story here, but Putin's been around for a while. And if you see some of the practices of Putin as at least sharing some kind of echo of the Soviet past, like, people used to write to Stalin to solve their problems. Technology was different, but, the answers were a little slower in coming. The results weren't tweeted out in real time, but nonetheless, there's an element of doing what the public, broadly speaking, expects, and they may not expect you to fix potholes. Some might, but maybe they expect different kinds of things, and those are in turn, I think, a function of how the polity has developed over the course of decades. Yeah, go ahead. And then there are a couple last questions from Stephen Yet, and then I will call an end to this fantastic presentation. Go ahead.
I just want to make a point. I really like that you brought up the complaint system, right? That writing letters to Stalin. Like, this is not new. It's not, I mean, it is, more people are aware of it. It is much more like timely and live. People can just click on their television and see it happening in real time. So that helps with both the popularity and therefore the breadth, the scope. But these are old techniques. Nothing is really new here. You can even go back further than the Soviet Union. Think about under the Russian Empire, the system of petitioning the Tsar. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's language that a lot of my interviewees use. Like, oh, this is just another, like, Putin is our Tsar and we're here to petition him directly. So this is actually a connection that many people who are watching this are making. So nothing's new under the rainbow. This is all old stuff. But it's just received more of an immediacy because technology.
Well, listen, I mean, if you don't keep making a better mousetrap, like, you're going to start, the mice are going to outwit you, right? So that actually leads to a question from Stephen Yet. He says, social media appears to be a more routine and dynamic mechanism relative to the direct line. So, at what point does the regime have to pivot to the new technology? And any sense that there's a need to do that yet, or is the direct line still doing what the direct line does?
Yeah, I think the direct line is starting to outlive its usefulness. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that they decided not to do it for 2020. Piskel said that the reason for this is because Putin's essentially always doing the direct line now by talking to people in times of COVID. But I think they are definitely seeing that this is not quite being as effective over time. We see this increase in the number of people who think it's just to influence Putin's ratings. I could basically say you flip a coin if we see this again. I think we probably will. And that's in large part due to who are the people most likely to buy into it. It's probably not these young, super politically sophisticated people who are on Twitter or contacting or what have you and constantly learning about politics. These aren't really the people that they're trying to reach. They're trying to reach, the babushka at home, who's a big fan of Putin and doesn't really do much in politics otherwise. So I could definitely see them pivoting towards including more of a social media aspect. They definitely now, it's not just calling in, you can tweet at them, there's like online apps, you can use video chats. And so they've started kind of incorporating this a little bit more. So I definitely could see this being more of a trend in the future. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, one of the things that Russian citizens, if you look at Sarah Oates' work on the media, seems to be sort of consistent over time, is the public has an expectation that the media / official media will lead them to in ways that the media is not there simply to cover events. It's there to lead them to the issues and the solutions to those issues. So it's a very different, if you take CERES work seriously, and I do, it's a very different way of thinking about this. And so who knows? I mean, next 5 years, we'll chat again, right? Hopefully in Toronto. Thanks so much for this. Thanks to all of our great questions from the audience. And thanks to the team in the background. Zooms don't happen, you know, spontaneously. So there's a whole team in the background. Thank you, team, Joey Hawker, and others who've been involved in this. And thanks especially to Professor Chapman for this terrific talk. I look forward to reading the book.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It was truly a treat to, you know, focus on research a bit and teaching in times of COVID, as many of you may know. So it was really a pleasure. Thank you all for the amazing questions.
Now really, we can go back to obsessing about American politics. There you go. All right. Take care, Hannah. All right. Bye to everybody.